We are taking you to Melbourne, where opposition leader Sussan Ley is about to comment on Labor's climate targets.
Shadow Cabinet just met and resolved that we are dead against Labor's 2035 interim emission reduction targets. Cost and credibility are key, and as I said this morning, we will interrogate and test this announcement for cost and credibility. It fails on both counts. It can't be believed because the government assumes that the 2030 target is in fact met. Because the government assumes that the 2030 target is in fact met, when clearly it will not be. The credibility is in tatters. In addition to that, there is nothing in this announcement that demonstrates to Australians how much it will cost. And that's not reasonable for households, for businesses, for the hard-working manufacturers in this country who want answers and are seeing their electricity bills skyrocket. Under this government, we're seeing a trifecta of energy failures. Costs are up, reliability is down, and emissions are flatlining. I have always said we take our responsibility seriously to play our part in reducing emissions internationally. But under this government, emissions are flatlining. 28% when we left office, 28% now. You cannot trust a single thing that this government says. Built into this model must be an assumption that we had a $275 reduction in electricity prices. We know we didn't. Instead, electricity costs have gone up by 39%. And households and businesses are really feeling this. So if the government wants to have an honest conversation with Australians, they need to be upfront about announcements they make in critical areas of energy. Energy is the economy. They need to be upfront about what it will actually cost. Australians deserve to know this. We will always fight for hardworking Australians, for their futures, and we know how much those futures depend on the household cost of electricity and for manufacturing, the cost of energy. Ted.
Thank you, Susan, and I'm here today both as the Shadow Treasurer but also as the Acting Shadow for Energy and Emissions Reduction in Dan Tian's absence at the moment. This announcement from Labor today, no policy detail, no costing detail, no price impact detail. Labor has no credibility to date because they are failing on their 2030 target. There is no chance they will achieve this 2035 target. Why is it that the government is releasing so much information but fails to tell the Australian people the impact it is going to have? The Treasurer has a 53-page document. I've had a quick read. Not once does that document, apparently modelled by Treasury, outline the cost of Labor's plan to get to 2035. We've seen this movie before. Nearly 4 years ago, this government in opposition stood up and promised the Australian people a $275 reduction in household power bills. Australian households are now paying up to $1,300 more than what they were promised based on their modelling. But the modelling they've done today, that they are releasing in support of their 2035 target, doesn't tell the Australian people how much it's going to cost, does not tell the Australian household the price impact, nor Australian businesses, nor regional Australia. This government has no credibility when it comes to climate change and energy. As Susan has made very clear, over the last 3+ years, under this government, we have seen prices go up, reliability go down, and emissions just flatline. They have zero credibility whatsoever, and today's release of information was nothing more than a word salad of promises which, again, will not be kept. And to have a promise of 2035 based on this false premise that 2030 will be met, when I cannot find one independent expert in the country which says 2030 is actually going to be met. This is an absolute offence to the Australian people who are suffering under a cost of living crisis as a direct consequence of poor government policy, and Australians would rightly be deeply concerned about the 2035 target, and on their behalf, on behalf of the 27 million Australians who are struggling under this government, the Coalition will absolutely oppose this 2035 target.
Questions? I will just go around the room.
Thank you. The Coalition is hopelessly divided on targets for 2050, so how can the Coalition have any credibility on targets for 2035?
Ted and I have just come out of a shadow cabinet meeting where I can assure you there was absolutely no division in opposing Labor's latest piece of train wreck energy policy. And we know that we're doing this on behalf of hardworking Australians who actually expect better from a government whose credibility is in tatters. Today, you have a government that I believe is alarming Australians who don't trust them on energy policy, who cannot believe when they said they would get a $275 reduction to their power bill, that they would meet a 43% target by 2030. That's just 5 years ago. And as Ted says, there's no one in the country who actually acknowledges they can do that. And now they're doubling down with another glossy piece of modelling and communications when simply these targets cannot be met. They are fantasy. We know, Australians know, and they're very disappointed in this Prime Minister.
Would the Coalition support any investment subsidies to try and help the private sector get to this target?
We want the private sector to invest. What we're seeing in this country is the private sector and global capital walking away because there isn't investment certainty, because the cost of manufacturing, the cost of doing business and the return on capital just doesn't add up. Why is that? Because energy costs are so high, because energy is unreliable and unaffordable. We see that in households, we also see it in the manufacturing sector.
This morning you described net zero by 2030 as woefully impossible, rather the target of as woefully impossible. Do you think net zero by 2050 is also woefully impossible?
Our energy policy is going through a detailed policy development process. That's our energy policy more broadly. We've got a working group led by Dan Tehan. He's in the US at the moment. He's studying the latest developments in nuclear. And we've got colleagues across our parliament in terms of our parties meeting together and having really detailed, informative policy discussions. That work will continue as it should. What we're doing as an opposition is responding to this latest disaster in energy policy that this government has brought forward. We will hold them to account because we know that this is grounded in fantasy land. Targets must be achievable and realistic, and these are not.
This plan isn't as ambitious as some other countries. Perhaps the Prime Minister says it's responsible. Do you not agree that perhaps it's that middle part of where other countries are heading?
We'll always act in the national interests for Australians, and other countries will do similarly for themselves. It is not a matter of looking at other countries, but recognising that we need to play our part in a global sense in tackling emissions and helping to bring them down. This government has failed on that account. This government is also not acting in the interests of its citizens or its manufacturers by coming up with this fantasy and unrealistic targets that cannot possibly be met because they are built on flawed assumptions.
If the government tries to legislate this target, will you allow members of your team to vote in favour for it?
Well, we don't support the legislation of this target. We don't support the legislation of this target, and the Liberal and National parties, in terms of our shadow cabinet, have met and absolutely underlined that point.
According to the modelling done by Treasury, the economy would be $2.2 trillion bigger by 2050 if we go down this path. Do you accept the modelling done by Treasury? And if you do, can we afford not to go down this path?
Well, let's just look at the last piece of modelling that this government did, which was that you'd have a $275 reduction to your energy price and that people's energy costs would fall. What's actually happened is they've gone up. They've gone up by an average of $1,300 a household. So the modelling needs to be very carefully interrogated. I do not accept the modelling that this government brings down, particularly because the assumption is that we will meet a 20, 30, 43% reduction target. That is clearly not going to happen. So if the principle of this modelling is that, then clearly it is in fantasy land.